Hello, everyone. My name is Colton Harris, and I'm a program manager at the Connecticut Office of the Arts. And I'm delighted to welcome you to a virtual reading, a meeting of the hearts and minds around poetry featuring our 2023 Youth Poet Laureate, our brand new 2024 Youth Poet Laureate, and our Connecticut State Poet Laureate. The purpose of tonight in this session is to really have dialogue around the power of the written and spoken word to highlight the initiative that we are partnering with Urban Word New York City, who oversees the National Youth Poet Laureate program. We're grateful to have been in partnership with them to really highlight youth poets and youth poets, not just from an artistic and creative standpoint, but also for civic and communal engagement. These are leaders of now that we want to nurture, support, and cultivate. And we thought that it would be a great idea to create a dialogue and a space in which our youth poets can share their stories, their work, and talk intergenerationally with our state poet laureate to really explore how we can all come together to continue to create and express ourselves and to evoke social change in our community. So we'll share some more information about the program and some other things that we have at the Office of the Arts, but thank you for either being here with us now or watching this back. So to kick off our time together, we really want to start with some poetry. So with that, I'd like to welcome to our virtual stage 2023 Youth Poet Laureate, an acclaimed writer, thinker, and artist who is really moving and shaking in their spaces around not just Connecticut, but all over. So let's welcome Mercuri Lam.
Um, I'm currently studying expression. So it's really nice to be here. And today I have one poem called Botanical Study. It's pretty new. I wrote it this summer. Okay, so here we go. We have two eyes, yet a field of singularity in vision. What this means is that when we turn ourselves away from suffering, nobody has to get hurt. Example one, the orchid tattooed on the small of my back, each dot and line of skin blooming from ink to the flowering pots perched on the kitchen windowsill, drinking greedily of the light, trying its best to hold on after all this time, with the sweet flowers wilted and nothing left to ruin. It's like the way I saw a rabbit learn how to bite in its moments of desperation. The same way I learned of desire when we walked through the bridge, watching the city lights dim as the river stretched beneath us. It wasn't about the brightness, but so much more its absence. When reasoning reaches a dead end and only emotion could take over the things I thought I knew about my own wants. So I reached for the warmth, the scorching haunt of words. Maybe this is the ugly, thrilling truth. I didn't imprint myself with blooms due to nostalgia, but instead this animalistic desire to be loved. Darkest hours beauty. When the sun finally rises, I can barely make out the shadows of your face. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercury, for sharing your brilliant work. And let's just use the chat if you want to affirm or use reaction features. And we're going to hear more and learn about Mercury and how to connect with their work and all that they're doing. But thank you for sharing such powerful work and continuing the spirit of creativity. And with that, I'd like to bring to our virtual stage our state poet laureate, Antoinette Brim-Bell, who is an acclaimed writer and an activist in her artistry and so many beautiful things that we'll share and tease out in the stories. So with that, I'd like to bring Antoinette to our virtual stage.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am always so excited to meet the youth poet laureates. They come with such a dynamism and freshness, and it lets me know that poetry is in good hands. So I am going to introduce our 2024 Youth Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut. I had a wonderful opportunity talking to Z, and let me tell you a little bit about her. So Z is a Chinese poet and performer. Her work is published or forthcoming in American Poetry Review, Poetry Northwest, Rust and Moth, Tinderbox, Poetry Journal, Kissing Dynamite, Gigantic Sequins, Grist, a journal of the literary arts, and Peach Magazine, along with others. A Best of the Net nominee, Z has been recognized nationally and internationally by the Poetry Society, the National Foundation for the Advancement of Arts, the Alliance for Young Artists and Writers, Poetry Society of Virginia, Palette Poetry, Writer University, Poetry Online, the Claudia Ann Seaman Awards, the American Library of Poetry, the Hillstead Museum, Connecticut Office of the Arts, the Fitzgerald Museum, Poetry Online, Marymount Manhattan College, Break Bread Magazine, the Tom Howard and Margaret Reed Poetry Contest, the Brett Elizabeth Jenkins Prize, Frontier Poetry, and more. Z serves as the current Youth Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut. She has been invited to perform for over 15 events, including a poetry special by the Connecticut Office of the Arts, Break Bread Literacy Project Reading Series, the Connecticut Survivors Art Summit, the Hudson to Housatonic Scholastic Writing Award Ceremony, and Erica Lutzer's Connecticut Poetry Salon. In 2022, Z founded the Dawn Review, a literary magazine dedicated to supporting writers while promoting convention-defying work. An alumna of the Iowa Young Writers Studio, ADROT Summer Mentorship, Shawnee Young Writers Conference, and the Kenyan Young Writers Workshop. Z will be studying English at Princeton University this fall. She is currently working on a chapbook manuscript titled No One is Ever Naked. So welcome, Z.
And at this time, we'd like to welcome Z to the virtual stage to share some work with us, and then I'll guide us through what's going to happen next.
Hi guys, so thank you so much for having me. It's been Mercury, it was so nice hearing your work. It was so inspiring. And I'm gonna share one poem for now. It's called Translocation, and I wrote it this summer. 1. The first boy I kissed told me, "You have this crazy thing where you refuse to settle within reasonable confidence on anything. It's like this constant pull where you refuse to ever align yourself anywhere. Talk about feeling disconnected." I kissed him to prove him wrong. Anyway, I've been studying the migration of sunlight by collecting all the sweat I've ever sweat in a bucket. To know you, I've been eating flowers and bisecting whole trophic levels. 2. Having it all is like killing my teenaged grandparents. I hide in a farm before the job. It reminds me of summer camp. A foot away, someone said, "She's using that bug spray like perfume." Really, I was coaxing gnats to stand on my elbow. I hold myself near orphaned goats, cooing, "I don't love you, please keep licking me." Months ago, they raced into a storm to prove they could swallow all this world's relentless water. Now, their mother won't look at them, and I am covered in goat shit, screaming, "Look at me. I am the land's land." 3. The deeper you go, the weirder it gets. A couple prays over goat stew at our table. Boys trudge through birthdays, trying to figure out when their parents last talked. I lean on a stranger, like a pin nestled in a puzzle. When my friend feels lonely, I steal her a flower from the grave I stepped on days ago. Last night, I tossed puzzle pieces across a table for hours before realizing my parents had never been born. In another world, I am still leaving my hair anywhere, loving anyone. 2. I've left dinner to stare myself down in the bathroom. I need to be touched, and I don't know what to say next. 1. My first day home, I don't finish what I started. Instead, I force mud into my bath sponge, align my empty space to walk through lovers. More and more, I am leaving the scene to study pinpricks and clotted bug spray everywhere I go. Kids gape at me, not sure why I'm still waiting to be claimed. I know too well that there is nothing hostile in the way they scatter, how in their world, the land is just the land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Z, for sharing your powerful work. Yeah, it's just powerful to already hear what you're thinking about how you're thinking, and this is why we're going to transition into is a bit of a dialogue. I think as artists, we are very much sometimes seen in the world as transactional, commodities. Do the work, give it to us, and discard. But we're really interested in having a dialogue between the poets here. So feel free as we go throughout this dialogue to put any questions or comments in the chat. Anything that is uplifting or encouraging, because that's what we want to do, is to continue to nurture our artists. And so at this time, what we're going to do is just have a little bit of a dialogue, just to ask each other questions about poetry, about process, about ideology, and about our stories, because we believe that the stories of artists are really, really critical. So I'm going to invite our youth poet laureates, as well as our poet laureate, to come on camera and off mute. And we're just going to have a little bit of a dialogue, and I'll throw out a first question, and then everyone can kind of answer, and then we can kind of spring from there, and feel free to ask each other questions in real time. Just have this discussion and dialogue about who we are, and where we've come from and where we're going. So my first question, and we can sort of popcorn it, and folks can ask, who wants to start first. But I'm really curious for our laureates. How did you find poetry, or how did poetry find you?
Z, why don't you jump in? You had a great answer to this.
Of course. So I was just talking to Antoinette about this a few days ago, but I was saying how I think in daily life it's really, really hard to discover truth, because you have all these daily conversations, but they're sort of distorted by social mannerisms or expectations or interests, or just the constant noise and oversaturation that you find in society. And so for me, poetry is really a way of digging at what the truth is and expanding on that. And more on that line, I think poetry is something that helps me to feel and to become fully human, because, what we do in our daily lives is we have experiences, but everything is very goal oriented, and life moves at such a pace that a lot of our experiences aren't fully lived or fully processed, or a lot of the people we interact with, we don't fully connect with. But through the realm of poetry, I think I get to rectify those gaps for myself and really, truly find the deeper connections and the undertones between myself and also between myself and others. So that's what poetry means to me.
That was really interesting to me because when Z and I were talking, it was as much about learning herself and knowing herself as it was entering into the larger uh, conversation, the larger poetic conversation that's going on. And I also use poetry as a truth telling or truth seeking tool. Oftentimes I say, I don't know what I believe, until I've worked it out on the page. I've interrogated, the language of it, the meaning of it, how it presents itself on the page, not only to the larger audience, but to me. I was wondering, Mercuri, if you kind of felt the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Z. I think truth finding has been a really key point in poetry for me, in terms of like emotional vulnerability and just like understanding myself. However, I would say that like something I really admire about poetry and something that I've realized has shifted my relationship with poetry over the past year is like this connection to like community and people around me. And like the amount of things that being Youth Poet Laureate even has like brought me to different places. So like for like one of the examples that I have is like I'm really involved in activism and protest organizing, and a large part of like how I got involved in the past year in Connecticut was like through hosting either it was like whether it was like poetry based or art based fundraisers for PCRF or like relief funds, and or going to teach at like poetry solidarity coalition based workshops. I think both of those things were like really impactful for me. And it just really showed me the strength of like connection and community and how poetry can facilitate these conversations.
So do you see your poetry and your activism to be one and the same or in tandem, or um, explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think they definitely go in conversation. Like they go hand in hand for me. I think that they're both things that I'm very passionate about and things that have helped me, connect with other people. Um, and I will say, like, I was really grateful that the opportunities that I had were through poetry has allowed me to like get involved in organizing, get involved with protest organizing, and like just a lot of the general things I've done today where it actually has an impact on the community and like people around me and people I know. Um, so yeah, in that sense, I would say it really helps me to feel like I can be more confident when I'm speaking to others that my poetry can actually change their lives and have some sort of impact on them.
I was wondering, Z, because when we were talking earlier, you had said something about there not being a really big dividing line between knowing yourself and knowing the world. Do you want to jump in with some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, for sure. It's so funny because I was talking about this idea with you, and then I was talking about the same exact idea in one of my classes. And it's really the idea that there's no permanent self, I think, beyond all of your interactions with everyone else, right? If you just think about your daily interactions, there's not one relationship in which you are your true self. Instead, it's through the shifting dynamics of all of your relationships and all of the ways that you interact with the world around you and your environment, whether that be people or whether that be ideas or institutions. And I just find that so beautiful because if you want to understand yourself, then you really have to understand all of these complex relationships. And if you want to understand these relationships, then you have to understand the rest of your environment that you're situated in. But then all of those other things in the environment, they're not static either, right? They're also defined through their relationships. And so for me, I think poetry is really about parsing each of those relationships and finding one sort of static point within this very, this mosaic that's constantly moving. But through this static point, through this poetry, also being able to sense that movement. And that's really what draws me to the craft as well.
It's really interesting. Jump in, Colton.
Yeah, yeah, no, I would love to like a word that was used a couple of different times is institution. And I know we have like different relationships with different institutions. And I just wanted to ask, you know, with all of you and your story and your journey, did you did you start creating or writing through like a school sort of introduction to poetry, or was it outside of an institutional space? Because in Mercury, you're talking so beautifully about how poetry has been such a sense of community for you. But in you all's sort of origin stories of figuring out that you could write or that you could be a poet, was that through educational institution and spaces, or did you find your writing outside of those spaces?
I mean, like for me, I kind of just began writing on my own. But I did have a lot of resources. Like, when I was a sophomore, I went to this poetry program, at Kenyon College, and that really inspired me because I met so many people. And that's when I think that the foundations of poetry as a way of community building was also established for me, where like I met all these people and they were really committed. Everyone was from different backgrounds, but they were all really committed to learning how to write and like learning how to help each other. And so that's where I got my roots in just like formal poetry writing. But even before then, I think I always really like to write. I really like to talk to different people and their like reading as well. And all of those voices just really affected me when I began writing.
How about you, Z?
For me, I'd say like I've found my voice through many institutions, but then also on my own. Like Mercury, I think educational programs have played a big part in my journey. I remember I think one of my most formative educational experiences has probably been the Iowa Young Writers Studio. Because we just approached poetry from such an interesting perspective. We talked about the idea of like what an object is, and um I think how to approach the idea of an object from many different angles. And it was very philosophical, but it was also very human. And I made some of my closest writer friends, but also just some of my closest friends, period, through that program. I was telling Antoinette about this, but another program that was really inspiring for me was actually this intensive I did at Interlochen. And we would just do these really funny exercises. Like we would count grains of rice, or we would like stare at a piece of colored paper for 30 minutes and then just write off of that. And it sounds really funny when you talk about it, but it's all about really like destabilizing the patterns that you live by and doing these little acts to just live very intentionally and curate your lived experience very intentionally. And I think that really does wonders for your mindset. But then I think another institution that, you know, I was like willingly part of was my literary magazine. And I think that was also very important because it allowed me to meet a lot of, you know, like-minded writers and also learn from new perspectives on the idea of institutions in general. I actually think about this a lot, is I think it's important to be able to like fully devote yourself to an institution, but it's also important to be able to think beyond the institution. And I think that holds true in writing, it holds true in life as well. Um, where I think it's just I've been a part of a lot of educational institutions where I don't fully agree with what they're doing, whether from a standpoint of like methodology or just the culture, but I think that doesn't necessarily have to prohibit you from appreciating the people within the system and connecting with them as people and using the system to your advantage such that you can generate these real human connections. And once you generate those connections, sort of using them to help develop your own voice and lift up the voices that you believe are important to you.
It's so fantastic, and actually, and would love to hear from you as well on that, Antoinette. Like thinking about your journey, like in your origins of writing. You know, were institutions critical to that, or was that really independent?
Well, I think the genesis was independent. My grandmother gifted me books all the time, never toys. And so I came to understand, I think, poetry at a very young age. In about 7, I started looking at contemporary poetry. Um, I always joke about how the fact my mother and grandmother never paid much attention to things like age appropriateness or whatever. It was always, here's a book written by someone you should know, so read it. And so, I was reading, Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes, at 7. And a lot of it, perhaps I didn't necessarily understand, but I liked the language. I liked the way it sounded. I liked the way it looked on the page. It was very different, of course, than prose that I had, become accustomed to. And so my explorations were solitary and just kind of working my way through the language. Of course, then, you have your poetry units in school, and I was very fortunate to have, amazing academic experiences that were helpful. But then, as Z said, some institutions have their own bents. And so you're learning, a particular canon or what a particular person might think is what you should know or you should have read to be well read. And I think all that foundational stuff is important, and I'm very grateful for that. But then, of course, when I chose my graduate program, I chose one that was very diverse, and that I knew I would see things from another perspective. And then I think too that when you're inside of these institutions, the thing that they're doing is really teaching you how to read, learn, discern, all of that type of thing, because hopefully you'll be a lifelong learner and you'll just continue to explore on your own. So yeah, when it comes to institutions, I think you know I'm thinking of what Z said, but I'm also thinking of what my grandmother said. Whenever she would say something, she'd say, "Everything out coming out of my mouth isn't gospel." Right? So it was to check it for yourself, think about it for yourself, and then determine what you think and believe. And I think that's true of all types of education.
Lovely. I think that that's so, powerful to see even the commonalities in your journeys of understanding where institutional practices are helpful, but also sharpening of you as a thinker, right? Because I think you all as artists are really inquisitive and curious about the world and what it means. And I would love to just ask another quick question, and then Antoinette, or if anyone else has any other questions, definitely feel free to hop in. So in all of your bios and even in some of our dialogue here, your journeys and experiences are enriched in culture, right? So the different cultural backgrounds and experiences. Would love to hear about how your cultural experiences have influenced maybe the way that you approach your work, or even the way that your work has been, maybe at times you feel like it's been received. But yeah, we'd just love to hear just your thoughts around your cultural experiences, and both like the spaces that you've been raised in, but the families that you come from, and what that's meant for you as a writer. Would love to ask Z, like, if you'd like to kick that off.
Yeah, so for me, this is actually very important to me. Although I don't overtly write about my culture all the time, I think it's always an important factor. Because I moved here from China when I was 4 years old. When I was entering elementary school, I really did not speak the language at all. And I think that actually is what fueled how intentional I am about language today. Because I think when you grow up just knowing and speaking a language, it's like second nature, right? But when you have to consciously relearn it at an age where, you're beginning to perceive some things, I think that made me a lot more attuned to the power of language and the intricacies of language. And, maybe that's why I actually came to love language so much and love poetry so much. But then there's also this aspect of my culture that led me to feel a little bit alienated throughout my childhood. Because, you hear this story all the time of I didn't know, the correct mannerisms, what seemed so obvious for other people in order to get along in social settings, like I had to learn from scratch. And so that was actually, I think, a very difficult process for me throughout elementary school and middle school. And I think it's a process that everyone faces in their own way, even if you're not like overtly an immigrant. But I think feeling like an outsider in some of those moments was actually also interesting for me as a writer, because it gives you a little bit of a different perspective on the systems that you inhabit, because you simultaneously are an observer and a participant. And I think the ideas that come at the intersection of that are really interesting. And then also just like reckoning with being a poet as part of my identity. Like when I go back to China and I visit my relatives, they all know that I write poetry and they're very proud of me. But there's such a huge gap between my world and theirs, I think. And so, they'll listen to my like poetry performances, but they don't speak English. And so it's kind of an interesting and sometimes a difficult bridge to navigate, because I'm writing from where I'm coming from, everything that I do, I really do want to, I think, like honor all the people that helped me get to this place, because my family has been just like, I think many, many like decades and generations of attempting to climb up the socioeconomic ladder. And it's owing to all of, my parents' hard work and my grandparents' hard work that I even am able to be where I am. So even though, the work that I do currently doesn't directly translate to, their lived realities and something that they'd necessarily be able to relate to, I hope that, it's still doing all of their efforts justice.
So good. How about you, Mercury?
Yeah, I think like Z, I also had a really different immigrant story, like where I immigrated to America when I was 8 and I didn't really speak English. But on top of that, I think I had this extra layer of just like how I was able to respond to that, because I moved by myself and I wasn't with my parents. So I actually didn't see my parents for about 4 years. And so I had to kind of like learn how to be independent, learn how to like do things alone. And I think that also like attuned me so much to like poetry and how poetry can be used as a means of connection. Because like not only did I had to like, like learn English, I also had to learn English in conversation with others without a lot of the community or like structural supports that should have been in place. And I think also along with that, I think a lot of my poetry was also affected by a lot of events in my life, and just like a lot of nature, because I grew up in a lot of different spaces where there were lots of plants, lots of flora and fauna, and that ended up being a really important way of how I approach things through visuals and through nature. And then on top of that, I would just say that I think since I began writing and since I became the poet laureate, I think a lot of my poetry has also, and a lot of my other passions, such as like politics or activism, like I said earlier, has just really become hand in hand, where I think poetry has become almost a source of like liberation for me and a source of liberation for others, where we are able to, through poetry, find solace and find community in times of struggle and like times of hardship. And I think that is really beautiful.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing and just hearing both like parallels and distinctions in poetry, not just as escapism, but also as like direct addressing of these like experiences and these environmental changes is really powerful. And so Antoinette, yeah, I would love for you to share a little bit of your thoughts on that. And then if you have any other questions, I'm loving this conversation so far. So thank you all for sharing your heart.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this conversation too. Um, I think, I was a military kid. My stepfather was in the Air Force. We traveled a lot. And so I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, a lot of different ways of thinking. And I think that really affected my worldview. I realized that my world wasn't, my little space wasn't the only way things were, that there were many different cultures and many different people and approaches to life and living, which made me also very curious. And I think that curiosity, bodes well for an artist and a writer, because I'm always looking for new ways to work out problems and to express myself. And I'm always researching new poetic forms and structures that are endemic in other cultures. And I'm interested to know why they use that particular structure and formation, and that how that can inform the way I am able to express myself. I I think every human experience is so unique that even when there's a tremendous amount of commonality. I mean, even when we're talking, listening to Z and Mercuri, a tremendous amount of commonality. Um, but then every perspective is different. And I look at the larger poetry conversation as this multifaceted gem, right? Where essentially we might be looking at the same thing, but the light is reflecting and refracting very differently. And that's interesting to me because, having grown up amongst so many different types of people, I know that my perspective is not the only perspective. And I'm wondering if another perspective is perhaps more clear than my own. Um, and I think that's one of the things I like so much about poetry. The more we learn about each other, the more opportunities we have to understand each other and to be empathetic to each other, and then to use that information to walk and talk differently, um, in our own lives. Yeah.
Yeah, love that. Yeah. So Antoinette, do you have any other questions or anything brewing for you
Yeah, I would like Z to talk to us about her literary magazine, her journal.
Yeah, of course. This is something I'd love to talk about. So I started the Down Review the summer after my sophomore year. And honestly, like I saw a lot of other literary magazines happening. I thought that they looked cool. But there were also some more concrete aims that I really wanted to accomplish. For example, I'd seen a lot of teen literary spaces where it was sort of like isolating a sector of writers, like emerging writers. I've seen a lot of emerging writer literary magazines. And, I think it's really important for emerging writers to have a space in the literary scene. But also, I wanted to create a magazine where emerging and established writers could really have their work portrayed together and be of equal value, because they really are, right? And I wanted to blur those boundaries because there's no concrete definition of what an emerging writer is. Like you could have someone who's 40 years old who's trying out poetry for the first time, or you could have someone who is quite young, but, has like been around the poetry community a great deal. Um, and so that was one of the things that I really cared about. I also really cared about making it so that anyone could access free feedback for their work. So that was something that we provided. And honestly, it was just such a great experience getting to know a lot of my fellow editors and seeing their personalities and their ideas shine through in their editorial comments and their ideas about pieces. And I think it was inspiring for me to be able to curate like a finished product of all of this really amazing work, and hopefully also inspiring for our contributors to be able to see their work in that finished product and hopefully be inspired by the work of others as well.
So how are you managing to balance the literary journal and school and all of these new experiences?
Well, I mean, it's a lot. So for the Dawn Review specifically, this year I handed off most of most of like the like editorial responsibilities to one of our executive editors, which I think is really important actually for the longevity of the magazine in order to have, you know, fresh perspective and to be able to like sustain itself, because it's in the end it's not just my project, right? It's not like my thing. It should be an entity in itself that's able to like organically live and grow. And then for college, like I think it's really difficult to make time and space for language and for reflection, because Princeton especially, like we really are a bubble. Like our campus is not that large. Everything is very contained. There's always something going on. So I think within that, like what's really important for me is just living very, very intentionally, because it can become very easy to just fall into a pattern. You know, someone's doing something and you just go along, and somewhere along the way, I feel like it's easy to lose yourself. I think about this a lot, is like at what point do people diverge from each other, right? Because every day, if you look at what people are doing, everyone's doing kind of similar things. You know, everyone's eating food and having conversations and going to classes. But within all of these very similar things, different personalities and identities still manage to diverge, right? So personally, for me, it's pinpointing the moments in which, you know, a seemingly obvious decision could really make a big impact on my life, right? Whether it be moments of just like making space for myself and being alone, or whether it be moments of, you know, going up to people who are unfamiliar and starting a conversation. So I think it starts from being really intentional about how I live my daily life, and then the writing stems from there.
I was wondering, Mercury, what is it like for you to try to balance writing and activism and college and just being a human being?
I think a large part of, you know, adjusting to different things that I'm passionate about and having able to balance them is like the amount of support I have. Um, I mean, like, I think I came into college with just a really good sense of what I wanted to do, and a really good sense of like who I wanted to lean on for support. And then on top of that, I mean, like, I did very similar things in high school where I kept up a lot with activism, where I kept up a lot with writing, and I was working a job as well as like a lot of other of my interests, and I was able to handle that. So I felt more confident that I was able to do these things. And I think the week that I moved in, I met a lot of different people, but I also had this like moment of connection that I think was really valuable for me, where a lot of the freshmen in my college at Yale, a lot of us went on a hiking trip together for like 5 days, and none of us had phones, none of us had watches, and it was just very surreal. And I think that that in itself, like, helped me get close with a lot of people very quickly. So once I was back on campus, like, I had a better sense and I felt more grounded to do the things that I was really passionate about and that I was really interested in. And beyond that, I think just, you know, like when you're really passionate about something, you're able to make it work and you're really able to put the efforts that you have towards making everything work out for you. And I think that for me, that was definitely one of the biggest things that helped me just get adjusted to college and like being able to balance everything I have.
No, that's a really, really powerful. And I was taking notes because I need some support on how to better balance life in general. So no, no doubt. And so we're gonna pivot to kind of wrap up to the end of our conversation, but it sounds like we're gonna need to keep doing these. So thank you all for sharing so much. I wanted to just ask the three of you maybe to shed a little light on your creative process, because I think so many people can probably resonate with this idea of being curious about the world or seeing things happening or experiencing things in life, but a lot of people don't then translate that into poetry. So we'd love to just hear some insight from y'all on how do you take these thoughts, feelings, and experiences and turn them into poetry. So give us an insight into your brain. And yeah, Mercury, would you like to maybe start off and talk a little bit about your creative process?
Yeah, I think I write best when I'm in community with other people. Um, But also, I think I have this notebook that I keep around with me at all times, in my bag. A lot of people I know are really familiar with it. Right now, it's like a very gold notebook. It's quite small, and it has a pocket of for like holding just miscellaneous things. Um, but yeah, I write down a lot of notes. I keep a lot of things, mementos that of places I go to, and I keep like receipts and museums just so that I can remember things that happened and I can keep it in a scrapbook. And I think just like looking through that and like also taking a lot of photos, having these like very visual representations of like my life and the people in them and like things that bring me joy really help me write. Um and like also I think one biggest thing is that I have this very visual approach to writing, where I feel like when I write, I'm kind of collaging this idea of like or like this tapestry of like different ideas together. And so having all these visual sources and just like talking to different people and like hearing their voices also really affected my work and just how I write. I also listen to a lot of music. So right now it's a lot of Adrian Lenker, it's a lot of Sufjan Stevens, and strangely enough, it's like a lot of house music. So yeah, I think that all these things just kind of coalesce into something, into like this atmosphere where feel like I can really write things that I'm proud of and things that are authentic to me.
That's so good. We need that house playlist ASAP. How about you, Antoinette? What's a little bit about your creative process?
It's changed over the years. I used to write from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. every morning. That's how my first two books came into being. But that was because I was, a single mom. And that was the time that, I could carve out for myself. So I was quite um, dedicated to that time slot. Uh, yeah, I don't think I could do that now. So now I, actually put it into my calendar and I look at everything that I have going on for the week and carve out little pockets of time for me to write. I oftentimes there'll be a word or a sound of a word, or um, I will, you know, hear just like a snatch of language, and I start to imagine, or a song, what would that sound like in poetry? And then that becomes a part of the process. Basically, I always kind of start with form. If I know that I'm going to be writing about something in particular, a particular word, particular sound or phrase, I'll ask myself, is that a word or a phrase that warrants repeating? And then I will look at forms that have wonderful repetition. If it's something that's going to be just a moment of reflection, or something that's just more lyrical and sound based, then I might look for a shorter form. But I tend to begin with the form and the idea and then the form and begin to work from there. And I will labor over each individual line one at a time until I work my way through to the end of the poem. And then I begin the process of stepping away and coming back and revising and doing that over and over. I love the revision process. It's wonderful when you have stuff on the page, and it's like having sand in the sandbox to play with. So I really enjoy the process of revision. What about you, Z?
Yeah, so like Mercury, I also have a notebook. I'm gonna like flash it on screen really quickly because I have like little doodles on it that like or like little notes like decorating the front and back cover that okay, here you go. Okay, that was the notebook. But I carry it around all the time. I journal a lot. So I think that's really important to me is that even when I'm not like consciously writing, and I'm not like, I'm not super prolific. So even when I'm not like in full writing mode, some part of the writer inside me is still alive because I think the way you write and the way you live are so interconnected and the way you think about your lived experience. So journaling is really important to me in that respect. And then I also, I do the same thing where I write down little fragments, little lines that I think could eventually go into something. And then when I feel like it's prepared enough, I'll start, writing it down in my notebook. I'll write down a bunch of different ideas. And then eventually I will, I move my thoughts from my notes app to my notebook and then finally to a Google Docs document. And that's where the magic really happens. I piece together all of these different fragments and attempt to make a coherent whole out of it. And I think a lot of my work is exploring sort of similar ideas, which it's just very broadly like how humans connect to each other. And it's like kind of an ongoing dilemma for me that I don't think will be solved ever. But as a consequence, I think a lot of my poems and especially a lot of my unfinished drafts are in dialogue with each other. So throughout the revision process, what I'll do a lot is maybe I'll take elements from two poems and I'll combine them into a new piece. Or, I'll change the form of one piece and then maybe I'll insert some other lines from this other piece into, a new piece. So if you look at all of my like 30 unfinished drafts right now, you'll find that a lot of them have the like a similar line or a similar idea. And so my revision process for, all these different pieces sort of goes hand in hand because once I revise one piece, I want to take this new piece in a different direction. So this isn't what I've always been doing. Sometimes I'll just write a poem from start to finish. I'll spend 30 minutes on line 1 and like 30 minutes on line 2, and it'll just be that until it's done. But hopefully what I'm doing right now will be fruitful because hopefully it'll create, this portfolio of pieces that are distinct from each other, but then also in dialogue with each other. And then I've also found that honestly, I write best after like I've lived a lot. Like I need to live in order to write, but it's usually after I've lived a lot and I've reached a tipping point where it's like I can't continue to go on and keep living more without processing this experience. And then, it's like I really need my time alone. And in that time alone is when all the thoughts come together and I have these very like lucid moments where, everything that was before unexamined becomes examined. And honestly, like that's one of the best feelings and that's why I keep writing. So yeah.
I love that expression, that basically paraphrasing what you said, but you need to live first before you write. And I'm an artist myself. I mainly make music and film. So my definitely thinking constantly about the writing process, but a principle that I definitely live by myself is my art will only be as great as the life that I'm living, because we thrive as artists when we are creating and writing about what we know. And you can know through research, you can know through empathy, but there's nothing like experiences washing themselves through you and it coming from that place of the soul. And I think that that's so powerful that you all have been sharing your souls and the experiences that you've had. So as we wrap up this conversation, I had an invitation that I wanted to give before we're going to hear another piece from Z, but wanted to really give an opportunity for Mercuri and Z to ask a question of Antoinette, really through the guise of thinking about this intergenerational work and experience. You all are in this really special time in your life, as we all are for different reasons, but really just wanted to open up the space for you all to ask someone who's a little further along the path than you, who's still writing, who's creating. And I think it's something to aspire to want to not just be a youth poet laureate, but potentially a state poet laureate, and thinking about your life and writing in the future and how she continues. So yeah, Z and Mercuri, would love for you to just ask of the wisdom of Antoinette.
Okay, so I have a question. And this is very like closely tied to what you were talking about intergenerational dialogue, which is what this whole event is about. But how would you say, since you've entered the poetry community, how would you say the poetry community has shifted, and how would you say, the way that you can find your voice within that community has shifted alongside?
That's a really great question. Um, yeah, I love this notion of intergenerational and wisdom, which I think is just a really nice way of saying, ask the old girl what she thinks. But no, how have things changed? Um, when I first was learning poetry and being taught poetry, I was being taught poetry from a very whitewashed canon. When it came to, institutions, talking about institutions earlier, academic institutions. Um, and you know, I had to kind of seek out on my own a more complex and diverse um, experience when it came to poetry and the arts. But recently, over time, I think that the poetry world, so to speak, has become much more diverse and more democratized. Um, it used to be when I would go to AWP and other conferences, there'd only be one or two people of color, in a sea of thousands. And that's not the case anymore. I give a lot of credit to the Cave Canem Foundation for um, supporting Black poets and creating opportunities for us to learn and to have mentors. And I think without Cave Canem, I don't think I would have come as far as I've come. Um, so I think things are changing. People are writing about things that I had never really seen in poetry before. When I was first writing, it was seen as kind of gauche to write what they used to call confessional poetry, which is in essence, writing about your own lived experience. And I never quite understood that. But now everyone is entering into the conversation with their culture and with their experience. And so there's a tremendous amount of diversity and opportunity for people to learn each other. It's wonderful when you go to a poetry reading and, it's a mix of sound and subject matter and everyone has their own voice to bring to the table. Now, when you're talking about developing your own voice, um, you know, you only sound like yourself unless you're constantly imitating what you're finding in the canon or what the institution is telling you to do. We all have our own way of looking and thinking and processing. And so I didn't ever really struggle with voice as much as I might have struggled with craft. There were some times when I wanted to write about particular things, but I didn't yet have the command of craft. And so I had to learn and leave some of those um, subjects until later, until I had a better grasp on how to manipulate language, how to use language. Um, and form. But I just say to bring yourself to the page, and you'll find your own voice. But as I was remarking to Colton before, the two of you signed on, that I am seeing such maturity and grace from young writers that there used to be conversations, will poetry die? Will it become passé? And the answer to that is absolutely not, because the younger generation is breathing new life into it, is changing it and making it their own, and bringing new form and sound and intentionality to the art, that I'm always very excited to see what the young people are doing. I think they have a lot to say, and they're bold. I know that some subject matters I've been afraid to address when I was younger, and I just see the young people just tackling that, and I think that's absolutely amazing.
Super fantastic. And so before we let Z read a piece to close us out, share some updates and information with you, Mercuri, do you, there's a question coming to mind for you, no pressure, but maybe one for Antoinette?
Yeah, I think that definitely I feel like since I've come into college, I've actually distanced myself away from a lot of, like, associating myself as a writer, and, like, I think I came in as someone who writes, and that changed a lot of my perception of, like, the way I approach things, the way I approach, like, my classes, the way I approach, like, socializing with people and, like, my extracurriculars. But I guess, I think that there is a fine line between, like, having past experience and, like, wanting to be associated with that. So, like, for someone who's looking to, like, branch out and start fresh, like, what is your advice? And, like, how do you think that you're able to, balance all these identities that you have and, like, all these different passions that you have at the same time?
You know, I'm very fortunate in that a lot of my identities and interests support each other. I'm a writer. I love, love, love to research. I do a lot of research for my poetry. Um, and then I'm also an academic, right? So I tell my students oftentimes, you're my captive audience. You have to talk to me about poetry and literature and all of the things that I like. So I live totally immersed in this whole notion of language and literature and research and all of that. So that helps in one regard. So if I'm reading something and I think it's absolutely fabulous, it gets incorporated into my lesson plans, and I have people to discuss it with and to explore it with. If I see a fantastic movie and they're utilizing time and space well, then I will, bring that into my creative writing class, and we'll pull it apart and look at storytelling. So all of that is very helpful. Right now I'm on sabbatical, and so it's going to be nerd paradise because I'm going to be, researching. So that's one way uh, to bring some kind of cohesion and some type of balance um, to your life as a writer. Now, you brought up something interesting when you said fresh start. And I think that that's interesting, and that you can have many fresh starts. Um, One of the things that I do is I still go to a lot of classes and a lot of workshops. sit in on a lot of lectures. I believe in mentors at large. If someone is writing something that I'm thinking is absolutely amazing, then I'll immerse myself in the body of their work and, kind of learn how they're doing things. And that way you never become stagnant, right? I do that also, I think, as a writer and as a teacher. Whenever I take a class, I'm looking for two things, right? I'm looking to learn the subject matter, but I'm also watching delivery, right? What can I learn in both regards? I do also have friends who are judges and lawyers and doctors, and they have a myriad of other hats that they're wearing, but they still carve out that time for writing, where they just, close themselves off and enjoy, or they remove themselves from their situation and they go hang out with their writer friends. Um, I think it's important. Writing is very solitary, but I think community and collaboration is very important and refreshing, because you get writers together and you're experiencing some of the same things, like process and balance and all of those types of things. I also think that writers should have some other kind of quote unquote hobby, or some other type of artistic outlet, right? Because sometimes you just need to clear your mind a little bit and then come back to the writing. I'm a printmaker, I make art. And so I'm doing this with my hands, and my mind is free to do what it needs to do. And that I come back and refresh myself. And I read widely, not just the stuff that I know I'm going to like, but things that challenge me. I think and I think the both of you have said this about living life, going out and having a myriad of experiences that, so when you come back to the page, you have new language, fresh metaphors, um, maybe a change of perspective, uh, and everything becomes fresh and you feel fresh and your writing becomes new to you again. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, I think you said so many beautiful things, and I want to thank you all for sharing. And as we continue these kinds of dialogues, I just want to encourage everyone to create spaces like this in your own life and in your own world, as we continue to create and share together. And even to your question, Mercury, something that was coming to mind to share, I think, with this artists in the room, as well as those who don't identify as artists, but you are a creator. I wrote down a phrase as you were talking, Antoinette, because I think it really was at the core of what you were saying, that your identity transcends your craft. So sometimes we identify with our craft or the things that we do that are expressions of our identity. But I think, even to your question, Mercury, like, you are the common thread in the web of your life. And that's so magical, to not even force yourself to become concrete, but to embrace your multidimensional expressions. And also, you're a storyteller, whether you're storytelling through activism, because activism is a form of storytelling. It's about capturing these narratives and shifting the stories. And our purpose and what we do always goes beyond the tools that we use. And so writing can be a tool, painting can be a tool, but I just love that you all are showing such humanity, and that's what's most important, and to continue to explore yourself, because I think sometimes in our society there's such a pressure to define yourself and who are you. And usually it's like, well, I work at, and it's like, wait a second, I didn't ask where you work, but that's always our impulse. This is what I do, or this is what I do. But who you are, and the kindness and empathy and love, and how you shift a room, and how you help people feel alive is really what matters a lot. So thank you all so much for being such dynamic and rich humans. And I look forward to having more of these conversations. So what we'll do right now is Z would love to invite you to close us out as we opened with the work and the heart of it. And I'll share a couple of things about things happening at COA after that. But thank you all so much for coming. And before we exit out, would love Antoinette and Mercuri as well. Feel free to put information in the chat of how people can stay in touch with you, get access to your work, and continue to keep these conversations going. But Z, over to you.
All right, so this is my poem that recently came out in American Poetry Review. I'm not like I don't belong to like an orthodox religion, but if I had to write a prayer for myself and the world, this would be it. It's called In Which the World Is Not That Bad, and I wrote it after Dorothea Lasky. Let me live with no intention. I triumph at the mile-long hair in my shower. Even in thunderstorms, more air is dry than not. There is no will that makes water cling to me the way you cling, but there is always the thought of water. I am telling you that blue does not mean sad, and couplets do not mean closure. Let the world hold no symbols for me. Let my every action be a symbol. I am porous as soil, and I get in everybody's boots. Down here, poetry has pressed itself to music. Intention is as delicate as the bones of a live fish, inseparable from the meat. Let me have nothing to swim through. Let colors convulse in me mindlessly. Let me not meditate, because to meditate is to staunch the greed in breathing. Let me be breath. There is really nothing to worry about when it comes to virginity. The deadness of our skin makes us all virgins, but there's always a sound that is a home. There's always toilet paper in the next stall over, but there is always high fructose corn syrup. And when you pick my bones, the femur has nothing to do with your divorce. And there is no ball and socket connecting my tibia to the ladybug you trampled this morning, and it is lovely. You can't pierce my shadow when I have already gone to become a mermaid. Let's rejoice because mermaids are incapable of having sex. Every time I talk to you, it is like kissing a new raindrop without knowing I have drunk it before, or swimming in a pool without edges. There is no difference between how you make fun of your friends and the people you hate. Your skin is slick, but there is no deception to it. If there was deception, then there would have to be a center. The center is all over us. You slobber over my temple no more than my armpit. We have always been this bright, this brackish. Whoever thought of poetry as an olive branch is an idiot. Let me be a fungal network or an ellipsis of dewdrops. Let me live in a house with no entrance or exit, only windows. In one of them, I am refusing to love you until you prove that you are worthless. In one of them, we have already infested each other, and we are bubbling through the doorframe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your work, and thank you again to Z, Antoinette, and Mercuri. Please stay in touch and in tune with all that's happening, and thank you all so much for just your presence here. Just want to give them a shout out. And also, here's some resources from the Connecticut Office of the Arts, especially opportunities for educators and those who are interested in continuing the heart and the spirit of poetry and art. We have a grant program called the Every Child Art Experience, where we're giving money to schools to support taking students on an out-of-school arts experience. And then our Poetry Out Loud poetry recitation competition is really important to our state. And we want you to know that if you know any students or schools that should be a part of this program, it's really, really critical in helping students even start to create and find their way through their own poetry and their own voice. And once again, thank you to Urban Word NYC for being a part of what we're doing here and helping us amplify this Youth Poet Laureate program. And once again, ct.gov/arts to stay